with all this terrific validation that's available just using HTML by itself, with the pattern and some of the other attributes that are possible on the HTML form tags, you might wonder, so where do you need JavaScript? How is JavaScript really going to help us beyond the things that are already in there? And the answer is there's a lot of things that are going to happen dynamically while you use a page that are going to require JavaScript in order to work. So the validation in HTML5 will stop somebody from submitting a form if certain conditions aren't met. But what if you want to take action before the user gets to the bottom and hits that button that says, okay, I think I'm done, and then they realize, oh, they're not done, they got to go back and fix validation issues. So let's look at some examples of some of the things that you might be able to do. Let's say I have a password field, and I start typing a password. Now, we can see already that I was getting feedback on the page that says, oh, my password is too short, it must be at least 8 characters. So I can go all the way up to 8 characters here, and now that message disappears dynamically. That's a JavaScript thing. It's a JavaScript thing that can interact with the HTML validation, and we'll look at that in an example in the next video, or in one of the next videos. But in any case, these things need to work together to create this kind of behavior. Now you can see here, it already is telling me the passwords don't match. And I could start typing any old sort of thing, and they still don't match, but when they do match, that message goes away. And you could imagine even replacing this with a green check mark or something like that that says, yep, this is good, you're ready to move on to the next thing. So let's look at another example where JavaScript is required to make the form better. Here we have a brief bio with a limit of 140 characters, and I could start typing, and as I type, you can see that it's actually telling me how many characters I have left. Now, HTML5 would let me say what the maximum length of this field is, but by itself, it won't give me that countdown, which anybody who tweets knows is a pretty useful thing. What about being able to populate one list based on another? I've got an empty select box here, but when I pick an author, this one populates with a bunch of choices that are only relevant to the choice I made in the first box, right? So these are the kinds of things that JavaScript can do for you. What if I have a form where I want to show and hide a section of the form based on a selection in another part of the form? Again, we're looking at JavaScript. Postal code, and we talked about this example in the intro in the beginning of this week. How come I can't just type the postal code and have the town, the city and state, or whatever other municipalities fill in for me just based on the postal code? Again, a JavaScript thing. Now let's look at this phone number field. You can see that it's showing me what the intended correct format is supposed to be. If I just start typing numbers, and I'm only typing numbers here, you can see that it's actually filling in the dashes for me, and it won't let me type more digits beyond the 10 digits that are required. And in fact, if I were to do something like, format this using parentheses around the area code, you can see that it actually clears those out. And even while I type, is making sure that this is going in the format that's intended, which is going to save me an awful lot of trouble as a user, instead of getting that message that I saw when I was ordering the replacement buckle for my grandson's car seat, when it actually stopped me and threw me out and made me go back and fix it, which is something that the code could have done all by itself. We see these kinds of things all the time. Good personalized hints. I start to enter a username, and immediately the form tells me whether that username is acceptable or whether it's already taken. And we're going to learn to do all these things either this week or going into the next few weeks when we look at Ajax as a way to get dynamic data from the server while we're actually interacting with a web page. Here's another example that would be Let's try that again. Here's another example where JavaScript would be required. Let's say on this form, I have a requirement that says, you got to give me a phone number or you got to give me an email address. You can't leave them both blank. Now, the required attribute in HTML will let you say phone number is required or email address is required. But if it's got to be one or the other, well, HTML5 by itself is not going to help you with that. You're going to need JavaScript. So if I were to try and submit this form now, I actually get, a JavaScript alert might not be the most beautiful way to provide feedback, but we're getting feedback here that says, oh, you got to provide either a phone number or an email address. So now if I fill in something here, let's make it look like an email address, that'll actually work. So you can see that the form submits because I filled in one of those fields. So any cases where you can offer faster validation while a user is still doing their business on the form is going to be a case where JavaScript can help you make the form better. Now in the next few videos, we're going to do a bunch of short examples that actually show different ways that this behavior can be implemented in a web form. And the reason that this is done as a bunch of videos, and they're, like I said, they're relatively short examples, is because you've already got the tools. You've learned about conditionals, you've learned about getting elements from the DOM, you've learned about checking properties on HTML objects, whether something is valid or not will be one of those properties. You've learned about testing values and formatting text and all different sorts of things. You've basically got the tools already to implement some really fancy behavior in forms. It's just taking those tools and stitching them together in the right way. So that's why we're going to go through, 4 or 5 examples of showing some of the ways that you can use mostly knowledge you already have to stitch together the behaviors and the properties of the things in the web form to create some of the behaviors like you've seen here and some other stuff that's awfully cool and leads to what I like to call frictionless experience for your web users by making forms work really well.